Quarantine corner, you better stay at home.
Hi, Brandon here, and it is late March and it is snowing. Today I just gotta draw a comic, so I'm gonna let you watch me do that, but you don't have to. So I'm narrating this after the fact just so you can get an idea of what I'm actually doing. So this is a strip in my Music in 4 Part series, and what I'm doing here is I am tracing an older strip so I know roughly what size the panels are supposed to be. You'll notice that I'm using a light board here. It took me way too long to realize that this is the way to go. I used to just draw in pencil, trace in ink, and then erase the pencil, but that would just mostly erase the ink as well, and it made it look pretty bad. This was a $50 one that I got on Amazon, and I've only had to replace it once in 5 years, so it served me pretty well. You'll also notice that I'm lettering here, and lettering is something that's always made me really nervous, especially when I started doing cartoons. Because I've always loved to draw, I always loved comics, but I was never that great at handwriting. There are plenty of cartoonists out there who draw with a really simple style that might look like they can't draw all that well, and I can still enjoy that work, but it really bothers me when the handwriting is illegible or unprofessional looking. So that's something that I've really tried to take upon myself, and it's taken several years for me to get to the point that I am now, and I'm still not entirely happy with it. So I'll often just trace something that I printed out online or use a digital text. But for these strips in particular, I always do it by hand. So this comic is part of my Music in 4 Part series, which is a monthly strip that takes a look at some aspect of music. It could be a piece of history, an instrument, an artist. And I try to tell like a story, a joke, or some kind of interesting take on an idea, and do it in just 4 panels. Now this particular strip is about Dylan going electric, which he did in '65, infamously. At that point, he'd become a cultural hero for his folk music, so it really alienated his audience when he decided to infuse it with a little bit of rock and roll. It's funny to think now because a lot of that stuff is among his most well-regarded music. So the premise of this strip is going to talk about how he alienated his audience then, and then once again in the late 70s and early 80s when he went through his Christian rock phase. So visually I'm going to represent that by having him in the same spot in the panel in all 4 panels, playing a different kind of music or whatever he was doing at that time. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the initial drawing and then tracing the rough outline in every subsequent panel. I want him to look almost the exact same shape and position in every panel, just the only difference being whatever music he was playing at that time. I was actually able to see Dylan back in 2016 in Portland, Maine. Now, 2016 I know is not really considered to be his prime, but it was a big deal for me to be able to see him because I was a fan for a very long time. It was kind of a festival setup, and a lot of people I remember were a little disappointed with the way that he would perform all of his songs, which was completely different than he had on any of his albums. So he would do Tangled Up in Blue, but it would be a very slowed down, countrified version. So for passive OG fans, they were a little disappointed. But as this comic points out, that's kind of keeping with the tradition of doing what he wants despite what the audience expects. So it's cool that he's still doing that today. And that's kind of the joke that I end on here, suggesting that he does some kind of a techno EDM dance music next. Now, in terms of my basic materials, I try to keep it as simple as possible. I just use printer paper, rapidograph pens. I pick them up at Michael's. They're usually around $40, but there's always a 50% discount available, so they're about $20 a pack. And they usually last me for at least a month or two. As you're about to see, I do all of my coloring in Procreate, which is an app on the iPad. At the time that I got it, it cost me $8. I think it's gone up considerably since then, but it was definitely the best money I've ever spent in terms of comics. When I started, I tried a few different methods, but the one I used most often was a cheap set of dollar store watercolors. The reason I used a cheap set was because it didn't overpower the ink. It was only very thin on the page, but the problem was when you scanned it and you upped the contrast or tried to make it look a little better as a digital file, it would usually warp and look a little funky. So digital looks more professional and it's also a lot faster. Now, I still need to do some fixes and the backgrounds, obviously, but I think that gives you a good idea of what goes into a average comic strip. Well, average for me anyway. Thanks for watching.